Well, hello, friends, and welcome to Ask Zach. Today, we're going to talk about the resurrection of my Buck Owens American guitar. So, if you remember, a couple months ago, I did a whole episode on the history of these guitars, and the next day, after I released the episode, the headstock broke off on this for the second time. And if you remember in the episode, it didn't have the overlay. And so I was wanting to get the overlay redone, because of course the original plastic ones crumble and fall off. But ended up having to have much more extensive repair work, restoration work done on this guitar. And so I ended up sending it off to a specialist in El Paso, Texas, named Dan Lambert, who, besides resurrecting the guitar, also did some wonderful modifications, like removing the adjustable bridge and inlaying rosewood and putting a nice saddle in there, redoing the bracings, and just turning this into a monster of a little guitar. But it needed a lot of work, so I'm going to tell the story about that today. All right, before we dive in, I need to thank my Patreon members, who are really, they are the engine that keeps this thing running. So I'm very appreciative of them. So thank you. If you want to join them in supporting the show, there's information in the description. There's a link. Also, there's other ways. There's tip jar information, and also, of course, there's merch like Ask Zach t-shirts and coffee mugs and such. So appreciate you guys, and appreciate you watching. And means a lot to me when you give it the old thumbs up, and also I read all the comments. So yeah, thank you. Let's dive in. So, of course, again, I did an episode a couple months ago where I talked about the history of these, and in the episode I was missing the headstock overlay. It had crumbled and fallen off like all of them do. So I was already thinking about trying to figure that out, and I had one of you guys actually sent one of the plastic overlays that was kind of squared off, so it had to be cut off and everything. But unfortunately, the headstock broke again. So of course, when I got the guitar, it was sold to me, or we actually did some swapping, with the understanding that the headstock had broken once, and of course it was glued and it was holding. However, right after I filmed the episode with this guitar and put it out there, the very next day it was broken. And so it was really interesting, because the night before it broke, I had played it that night and was just loving the guitar, and I put it on a stand here in my office and went to bed. And the very next morning I got up and I started, taking care of emails and such. And I looked, and I was looking on the floor, and I said, why are there guitar strings on the floor? And then I realized that the headstock for the guitar was on the floor, and the guitar was still upright in the stand. So here I have a photo that we can look at. And I was just like, oh no, it's broken again. So I took it down to the shop, and we glued it again. And it sat at the shop for a couple of days with strings on it and everything, and it held. Got it home, thought it was good. A couple days later, again, the exact same thing. Strings on the floor, headstock on the floor. So at that point, went back and started talking about different potential repairs. But the problem is that I didn't want to, I felt like the neck had a problem. I felt like the neck itself, I felt like the wood was rotten, because otherwise, why was the headstock breaking over and over again? And every time it broke, it would break further down. And so I was very concerned about what to do about the repair on it. So I have a friend named Alan Cross that lives out in California, and at one point I was visiting with him, and he brought a guitar, an Oscar Schmidt guitar, that I think probably from the 40s, and it sounded amazing. And I said, has something been done to this? And he said, yeah, my friend Dan Lambert has kind of redone the bracings, and he's made it, playable and done a bunch of stuff to it. And the guitar just sounded and played and looked fantastic. And so I thought, well, maybe I ought to reach out to Dan Lambert, because I knew he was doing a lot of conversions and modify, kind of, there's this whole, movement that, like Scott Baxendale, and there's also a cat down in Alabama that does a lot of stuff for Nashville players, where they take the old Harmony and K guitars and they, give them X bracings and do other things to them. So I thought that would be a good person to talk to. So I got Dan Lambert's number from Alan Cross, and I called him up. And in talking to him, he had actually done a lot of restorations on these Harmony Buck Owens. And so one of the great things is that he had a lot of experience redoing these. And so instead of using like a reproduction plastic overlay, he, like Scott Baxendale, would use a wooden overlay. And so in talking about what was going on with the guitar, we decided that was a better route than using a plastic one, because if we used a wooden one, it would actually help. It would adhere better to the other wood, and then of course you'd have something else to strengthen the headstock. So I shipped the guitar off to Dan Lambert, and in the process we talked about doing some other modifications. Like he had recommended removing the adjustable saddle, because it's just a sustain and tone robber, because instead of the strings, kind of sitting on the saddle that's in the wood, it's sitting on a saddle that's being held up by two screws, so you only have two contact points. So, it's kind of like the Gibson adjustable ridges. A lot of people will remove those. The other thing was he talked about recontouring the original ladder bracing. So instead of like a bunch of cats that just remove the ladder bracing and they put in X bracing, that Dan prefers to do something similar to what Oscar Schmidt did, where they had ladder bracing that was not just kind of crudely put in there, but it was actually kind of contoured and shaped more and lighter, instead of being this heavy, kind of sustain and tone robbing stuff. So we decided to do that, but things pretty quickly hit a snafu. So one of the things that Dan wanted to do was he wanted to check out the neck itself, and to do that he needed to remove the fingerboard. Well, when he removed this fingerboard, the neck basically came apart. So the neck on this guitar is made of poplar, not mahogany, and I don't know how much of it has to do with the fact that it's poplar and how much has to do with it just was not a good piece of wood. But one, the wood wasn't great, and two, the truss rod had been over tightened, and so you had this mix of wood that was kind of rotten and getting over compressed, and you had an over tightened rod, and it was a recipe for disaster. So what Dan decided to do in trying to keep this original paint on the back of the headstock and the back of the neck, which it still has, was he decided that he was going to remove as much wood as he could, that was rotten, from the neck itself, and he would inlay a large piece of maple. So there's a piece of maple, going from one end of the neck to the other that he inlaid in there. And of course, it does not have a truss rod anymore. So it has a cover here, but that's just for decorative purposes to make it look like the regular American. So instead, it has a block of maple that runs through the length of the neck. To reinforce the headstock, he did a number of things. He put in splines, on either side. So those, of course, long, thin pieces of wood, not overly thin, but to strengthen that. And then, of course, you had the wooden overlay here that, then again is a thin piece of wood. You can see kind of how thick it is. That is painted blue, and then he takes white shellac and paints it along here. And just a side note real quick, is that every Buck Owens harmony has a slightly different shaped headstock. So you can't make a one-size-fits-all overlay and just sell them, because all of them are shaped slightly different. So it's an issue, and so you end up having to have a pro do it, like Dan Lambert or Scott Baxendale or someone else to do this. But yeah, going back to the overlay, it's wooden, it's painted blue. The sides, the edges are carefully painted white, including the sides. And then this is a decal that came from Scott Baxendale. So he was kind enough to sell one of those to me, and then I sent it on to Dan. Let's see. Also, to strengthen it, he put a big volute. So that's what, obviously, because this wasn't there before, which I didn't mind at all. That doesn't bother me. Of course, there's all sorts of guitars that have volutes. They just get a bad reputation because of Gibson adding them, at a point when they were not making their best instruments. So, and he, kind of matched the paint here. So, these are the original tuners, and of course the original paint on the back and the sides of the headstock. Then, so that was all it had to be due to the guitar to repair it and restore it. But that was a lot. Then when it came to, just kind of modifying it, enhancing it, making it a better instrument, again, the adjustable bridge was removed, and nice rosewood was inlaid in there, and then he shaped a saddle for it. Then the whole back of the guitar, was the binding was removed, and this, the back was removed so that he could recontour the ladder bracings that's on the top, and then he carefully glued it back on, and put the binding back on, and kind of touched up the paint. And I have to say here that a lot of guys, remove the back, and they do modifications, to the bracing somehow. But one of the things with that, on a lot of these harmony guitars, it's not a big deal when there's little chips and little things that happen when they remove it and put it back on. However, with a Buck Owens guitar, the paint and the paint job is really important to the look of it. And so I really appreciated the fact that Dan Lambert was very careful about reinstalling the binding, and making sure the paint didn't get completely destroyed and such in that, because it's this is an example from 70 or 71, and the paint's in really good shape and not super yellowed. It's still pretty white looking. So yeah, so a lot of work ended up being done on this guitar, but it plays amazing. It plays and sounds great. It sounds much better than it did before. Just by doing what he did to the bracings, and also the saddle. Of course, you got more sustain, more low end, and just more punch. Also, I can't help but believe that the maple in the neck, and the stiffness of it helps the sound of the guitar. And of course, it doesn't have a metal truss rod, which a lot of people like the sound of guitars that don't have a truss rod on them. They have a different sound. So yeah, so I'm very, very, very happy with the restoration of this instrument. Again, as I said in the other episode, that where I was talking about the history of these guitars are a big deal to me, because this was probably the first guitar that I saw both in person and on television, as a kid. And of course, I love Buck, and I got to play with Buck, and Buck is a important part of my kind of musical lineage. And so I'm very happy to have this guitar all restored and back together, and I can't wait to play this thing out. I just need to decide what kind of pickup I'm going to put on this, maybe a K&K or such. So, but yeah, I'm very grateful to Dan Lambert. He did an amazing job. He very lovingly worked on this, and I'll include some contact information for Dan in the description. And I know he's going to be at some guitar shows out in I think maybe out in California, and I think he's going to be at the Franklin kind of Nashville guitar show in March, selling some of his wares. So you ought to check him out. He's a great guy, and a real pleasure to deal with. And he has like all the greats, he has a ton of passion for what he's doing. All right, guys. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode and a look at the resurrection of my Buck Owens American. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.